Burned flesh revealed the impossible butterfly tattoo. Christopher's trembling hands froze mid-procedure as 15 years of grief suddenly came into question. The emergency lights cast red shadows across the face of the injured woman who couldn't be his dead wife. Yet the distinctive three-star pattern trailing behind the butterfly wings was unmistakable. Single dad paramedic was about to become a lie he'd lived for 15 years. His heart raced with fear and desperate hope that threatened to shatter everything. The emergency dispatch call came through at 11:43 p.m., just as Christopher Morgan was completing his paperwork from the previous call. Structure fire, possible victims trapped, corner of Willow and 15th. He'd been a paramedic with the Los Angeles Fire Department for almost 20 years now, and while every call still got his adrenaline flowing, the procedural aspects had become second nature to his trained hands and mind. At 50, the lines around his eyes had deepened, etching stories of countless emergencies, personal tragedies, and small victories into his weathered face. He'd seen it all. The miracle births in the back of ambulances, the devastating multi-car pileups, the heart attacks reversed by quick intervention. But nothing in his professional experience had prepared him for what awaited at this particular apartment fire. The summer night was uncharacteristically cool as the ambulance pulled up to the scene, red and blue lights painting the gathering crowd of displaced residents and curious onlookers in alternating hues of urgency. Firefighters were already working to contain the blaze that had engulfed the third floor of the modest apartment complex. Christopher grabbed his medical kit and jumped out, scanning the crowd for anyone who might need immediate attention. His partner, Miguel, a younger paramedic with 6 years on the job, joined him as they approached the incident commander, a gruff battalion chief named Garrison who had worked with Christopher for over a decade. "Got a woman pulled from 3C, Garrison informed them, pointing toward another ambulance where a gurney was being loaded. Burns to the right arm and torso, possible smoke inhalation. "She's conscious but disoriented. Need you to transport to Mercy General." Christopher nodded, already moving toward the patient. As he approached the gurney, he noticed the woman's face was relatively unscathed, but angry red burns covered her right arm, with patches of her clothing fused to the skin. In his professional estimation, they were serious second-degree burns, possibly extending to third degree in some areas. She would need specialized burn unit care, but with proper treatment, she would likely recover. It was when he began checking her vitals, preparing her for transport, that his entire world shifted on its axis. As he secured her arm for an IV placement, he noticed a patch of undamaged skin on her inner wrist. There, partially obscured by soot but unmistakable to his eyes, was a butterfly tattoo, with 3 small stars trailing behind it, identical to the one his wife Eliza had gotten just weeks before she died in childbirth 15 years ago. Christopher's fingers froze mid-procedure, the butterfly with 3 stars. It had been their thing, a symbol of transformation and their 3 planned children. He'd helped Eliza design it himself, sketching it on a napkin during a coffee date when they were discussing starting a family. The likelihood of someone else having this exact same design, with the stars positioned in that specific constellation pattern, was astronomically low. His heart hammered in his chest, and for the first time in his career, he felt himself becoming lightheaded while treating a patient. He forced himself to focus, to breathe, to continue the assessment. "Christopher, you good?" Miguel's voice seemed to come from a great distance as Christopher stared at the face of the unconscious woman. Despite the passage of 15 years and the trauma of her current condition, he could see it now. The curve of her cheekbones, the shape of her lips, features he'd memorized in photographs and mourned daily. "Yeah, I'm fine," he managed, his voice betraying him with a slight tremor. "Let's get her loaded and to Mercy." He was operating on autopilot now, his training taking over while his mind raced with impossible questions. He'd identified Eliza's body himself after the childbirth complications that had claimed her life. He'd buried her. He'd raised their daughter Isabella alone, keeping Eliza's memory alive through stories and photographs. How could this woman, this burned stranger pulled from a fire, possibly have his dead wife's distinctive tattoo? As the ambulance doors closed and they began the journey to the hospital, Christopher found himself staring at the woman's face, searching for definitive confirmation or denial of the impossible thought forming in his mind. Was he seeing what he wanted to see? Was grief playing tricks on him after all these years? Or had his entire life as a widower been built on a devastating lie? 3 days passed with Christopher in a state of suspended disbelief. He'd taken personal time off work for the first time in years, claiming a family emergency that wasn't entirely a lie. The burned woman had been admitted to Mercy General's specialized burn unit, where she remained heavily sedated while receiving treatment. Christopher had used his credentials and professional connections to check on her status daily, lingering in the hallway outside her room, attempting to piece together an explanation that made any sense. Her name on the admission records was Lisa Turner, not Eliza Morgan, and her emergency contact was listed as none. The hospital staff knew him well from his years of bringing in patients, and no one questioned his presence or interest in the case, assuming it was professional courtesy for a patient he had transported. On the morning of the 4th day, Christopher sat in his modest suburban home, staring at the framed photograph of Eliza that had occupied the same spot on his living room mantel for 15 years. In it, she was laughing, her head thrown back in joy during their honeymoon in Hawaii, the sunlight catching her dark hair and illuminating her face with a radiance he had never found in anyone else. Beside it stood photographs chronicling Isabella's growth from infant to the beautiful, headstrong teenager she had become. At 15, she had Eliza's eyes and smile, but Christopher's determined jawline and analytical mind. The resemblance to her mother sometimes took his breath away, especially in recent years as she transitioned from child to young woman. Christopher had built his entire life around these two fundamental truths. His wife had died, and his daughter needed him. Now, one of those truths was possibly crumbling, and he didn't know what impact it would have on the other. His phone buzzed with a text from Isabella. "At Kayla's studying for biotest. Back by dinner. Love you." Christopher smiled faintly at the routine message. Their relationship had been strained lately. Typical teenage rebellion, he'd thought. But they still maintained their small traditions, like these check-in texts and family dinner on weeknights. He typed back a quick reply, then set his phone down, his mind returning to the impossible situation at hand. He had to know for certain, had to face whatever truth awaited before involving Isabella or anyone else. He couldn't risk shattering his daughter's understanding of her family history based on a coincidence or his own desperate wishful thinking. He needed proof, and there was only one way to get it. He had to speak to the woman herself. Decision made, Christopher changed into his regular clothes, grabbed his keys, and headed for the hospital. The burn unit was quiet when he arrived, the hushed atmosphere broken only by the steady beeping of monitors and the occasional murmur of nurses exchanging information. He nodded to familiar faces as he made his way to room 412, his heart racing with each step. Outside the room he paused, gathering his courage. Through the small window in the door, he could see that the woman was awake, staring out the window at the late afternoon sunlight. Her right arm and shoulder were heavily bandaged, and an IV dripped pain medication into her left arm. Christopher took a deep breath and knocked softly before entering. The woman turned, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of him. For a long moment they simply stared at each other, the hospital room filled with the weight of unspoken questions. Then Christopher found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "I was part of the team that brought you in from the fire," he began, the practiced introduction falling from his lips automatically. I know who you are, Christopher. The woman's voice was hoarse from smoke inhalation and disuse, but the cadence and tone struck him like a physical blow. He knew that voice, had heard it in his dreams for 15 years. His legs suddenly unsteady, he sank into the chair beside her bed. How? He began, but couldn't form the complete question. There were too many. How was she alive? How had she ended up in that burning apartment 15 years after he'd buried her? How could she have abandoned him and their newborn daughter? The woman, Eliza, for he was now certain it was her, closed her eyes briefly, pain crossing her features that seemed unrelated to her physical injuries. When she opened them again, they were swimming with tears. "I never thought I would see you again," she whispered. "I never thought I'd have to explain this to you, to anyone." Christopher's mind struggled to process what was happening. The surreal nature of sitting beside his supposedly dead wife, listening to her voice after 15 years of grieving her loss, threatened to overwhelm him. Part of him wanted to reach for her uninjured hand, to touch her and confirm she was real. Another part wanted to turn and flee from the truth that threatened to unravel the life he had built from the ashes of his grief. But the strongest part, the part that had survived losing her once already, needed to understand. "The body," he said finally. "I identified your body. They told me you had died from complications, a hemorrhage during childbirth." Eliza, or Lisa, or whoever she was now, shook her head slowly. "It wasn't me," she said quietly. "That was arranged. I had to disappear, Christopher. I didn't have a choice." "Arranged?" Christopher's voice rose sharply, drawing a concerned glance from a passing nurse. He lowered it again, leaning closer to the bed. "What are you talking about, Eliza? Who arranges to fake their own death? Who leaves their husband to identify a body he thinks is his wife? Who abandons their newborn child?" Each question emerged with increasing intensity, 15 years of grief transforming into bewildered anger. The woman who was unquestionably his wife, her eyes, her voice, her expressions all achingly familiar despite the passage of time, flinched at the barrage. Her uninjured hand plucked nervously at the thin hospital blanket, a gesture so characteristic of the Eliza he had known that it momentarily derailed his building fury. This was really her. Somehow, impossibly, his dead wife was alive, lying in a hospital bed before him, with a different name and 15 missing years between them. "I was trying to protect you both," Eliza said finally, her voice strengthening with resolve. "Before Isabella was born, I discovered something at work. Financial records that implicated several senior partners at the firm in a massive fraud scheme. When I brought my concerns to Marcus Hensley, the managing partner I trusted, he didn't help me. He threatened me." She paused, swallowing hard at the memory. "Not just me, but you and our unborn child too. These were powerful people, Christopher, with connections everywhere. The day after Isabella was born, Hensley came to see me in the hospital. He made it clear that if I didn't disappear, if I testified about what I knew, they would make sure our family suffered. He had details about you, your schedule, your routines that proved they'd been watching us. I was exhausted, terrified, not thinking clearly after the delivery. But I knew I had to protect my family." Christopher struggled to reconcile this new information with the reality he had lived. Eliza had been a financial analyst at a prestigious firm, specializing in corporate compliance, a job she had loved for its straightforward adherence to rules and regulations. The idea that she had uncovered criminal activity significant enough to warrant such extreme measures seemed like something from a thriller novel, not their ordinary lives. And yet, the woman before him was undeniably Eliza, telling a story that, however implausible, explained her absence. "So you just disappeared? Let me believe you were dead. Let our daughter grow up without a mother." The questions weren't just accusations. They were genuine attempts to understand choices that seemed unfathomable to him. Eliza's eyes filled with fresh tears, and she nodded slowly, the movement causing obvious pain. I made a deal with Hensley. The firm had connections with people who could arrange new identities, make people disappear. They had a Jane Doe in the morgue who resembled me enough that with some strategic alterations, she could pass as me in a closed casket identification. Eliza's voice broke on the last words, the calculated coldness of the plan clearly still horrifying to her. I thought it would be temporary. I thought once the investigation into the firm was complete, once arrests were made, I could come back and explain, but the investigation stalled. Hensley and the others covered their tracks too well. Then you and Isabella moved to start fresh, and I lost track of you for years. By the time I found you again, so much time had passed. Isabella was in grade school. You were established in your career. What right did I have to reappear and shatter the life you'd built without me? Christopher sat back in the chair, trying to absorb the magnitude of what she was telling him. The grief he had carried for 15 years, the countless nights he had lain awake, wondering how he would manage to raise their daughter alone, the milestones he had documented meticulously so he could tell Isabella about them someday. All of it had been unnecessary. All of it had been based on a lie, albeit one told under extreme duress. He thought of Isabella, of how this revelation would impact her. His daughter had grown up with an idealized image of the mother she had never known. How would she react to learning that this mother had chosen to abandon her, regardless of the justification? The firm was investigated 5 years ago, he said finally, recalling news articles about corporate malfeasance at several financial institutions. Hensley and 3 other partners went to prison for fraud and tax evasion. Eliza nodded, a sad smile touching her lips. I know. I followed the case closely. But by then, you and Isabella had a life established. You were doing well. She was thriving. I was Lisa Turner, living a small, careful life on the other side of the city. What would my return have accomplished, except to disrupt everything, to force Isabella to accommodate a stranger claiming to be her mother? She paused, meeting Christopher's gaze directly for the first time. I convinced myself it was better for her, for both of you, if I stayed dead, that I'd done enough damage already. The rawness of her emotion was evident in every word, in the trembling of her hand as she reached tentatively toward him, stopping short of actual contact. I never stopped loving either of you. I thought about you every day, Christopher, every single day. The hospital room had darkened as evening approached, but neither Christopher nor Eliza had moved to turn on the lights. The shadows seemed appropriate for the weighty conversation that had unfolded between them. 15 years of separate lives, of secrets and survival, of choices made in desperate circumstances that had shaped 3 intertwined destinies. Christopher's initial anger had ebbed somewhat, replaced by a complex blend of emotions he couldn't fully identify. Relief that Eliza was alive warred with resentment over the years lost. Understanding of her impossible choice competed with grief for what their family could have been. Above all, loomed the most immediate and pressing question: what happened now? The revelation of Eliza's existence would irrevocably alter Isabella's life and identity. Their daughter had built her understanding of herself partly around being the child of a father who had raised her alone after her mother's tragic death. How would she process learning that this foundational narrative was false? I need time to process this, Christopher said finally, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. And we need to think carefully about how and when to tell Isabella. Eliza nodded, wincing slightly, as the movement pulled at her healing burns. The doctors had assured her that with proper treatment she would recover with minimal scarring, but the process would be slow and painful. I understand, she said quietly. I don't expect forgiveness, Christopher. I don't expect to simply step back into your lives as if the past 15 years didn't happen. She hesitated, searching for the right words. I just want a chance to explain to Isabella myself, to tell her that not a day went by when I didn't think about her, when I didn't wonder what she was like, what she was doing, who she was becoming. Christopher was about to respond when his phone chimed with a text message. He glanced down at it automatically, then froze. It was from Isabella. Dad, where are you? I'm at the hospital. Nurse Katie said you've been visiting some burned woman from your call the other night. Are you okay? I'm in the lobby. His eyes shot to Eliza's, alarm evident in his expression. Isabella is here, he said, his voice tight. She's in the lobby looking for me. Eliza's face paled beneath the faint remnants of soot and redness from the fire. Christopher, I'm not ready. We haven't planned what to say, she began, panic rising in her voice. But Christopher was already standing, a lifetime of making split-second decisions in emergency situations taking over. She's already suspicious. If I go down there and try to send her home, she'll only become more determined to find out what's going on. You know how stubborn she is. A ghost of a smile crossed Eliza's face at this characterization of their daughter. She gets that from you, they said in unison, then stared at each other in surprise at the synchronicity that remained between them despite everything. Christopher's expression softened slightly. Let me talk to her first, prepare her a little, then I'll bring her up. He moved toward the door, then paused, turning back. For what it's worth, Eliza, I never remarried. There were a few relationships over the years, but nothing serious. I always told myself it was because Isabella needed stability, not a succession of potential stepmothers. But maybe some part of me never fully accepted that you were gone. The admission cost him something to voice, but it felt important to acknowledge. Without waiting for a response, he stepped into the hallway and headed for the elevator, his mind racing to find the right words to prepare his daughter for a meeting that would forever change her life. Isabella Morgan was pacing the hospital lobby when Christopher arrived. Her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her expression a mixture of concern and irritation that reminded him painfully of Eliza. At 15, she was already showing signs of the woman she would become, intelligent, determined, with a fierce protectiveness toward those she loved. She spotted him immediately and strode over, arms crossed defensively across her chest. Dad, what's going on? You've been acting weird for days, taking time off work, and now I find out you've been visiting some patient from a fire. Her voice was accusatory, but underlaid with genuine worry. Christopher guided her to a quiet corner of the lobby, gesturing for her to sit beside him on a small sofa. Isabella, there's something I need to tell you, and it's going to be difficult to hear. I need you to try to stay calm and listen, okay? Isabella's expression shifted from annoyance to apprehension at his serious tone. Is it cancer or something? Are you sick? The fear in her voice made Christopher's heart clench. No, nothing like that, he assured her quickly. It's about the woman upstairs, the one from the fire. When I was treating her, I noticed something. He paused, searching for words that could possibly prepare her for what was coming. She has a tattoo on her wrist, a butterfly with 3 stars, exactly like the one your mother had. Isabella's brow furrowed in confusion. So? Maybe she was a fan of butterflies too. Lots of people get similar tattoos. Christopher shook his head slowly. This isn't just similar, Bella. It's identical. I helped design it myself. And when I looked closer, he took a deep breath. When I looked closer, I realized that she is your mother. Isabella stared at him, incomprehension giving way to shock, then disbelief. That's not possible, she said flatly. Mom died when I was born. You told me that my whole life. Christopher nodded, acknowledging the truth as they had both understood it until now. That's what I believe too. But it's her, Isabella. I've spent hours talking with her. She explained what happened, why she disappeared. As concisely as possible, he relayed Eliza's story of corporate crime, threats, and the desperate choice to protect her family by removing herself from their lives. Throughout his explanation, Isabella sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond his shoulder. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, processing the revelation that fundamentally altered her understanding of her own history. "You're saying my mom didn't die," she said finally, her voice unnaturally calm. "You're saying she chose to leave us." "It wasn't that simple," Christopher began, but Isabella cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I want to see her," she said, standing abruptly. "I need to see for myself." Christopher nodded, understanding his daughter's need for tangible proof. Together, they walked to the elevator, the short ride to the burn unit passing in tense silence. Outside room 412, Christopher paused, his hand on Isabella's shoulder. "She's been through a lot, both recently and over the years. Try to keep an open mind, okay?" Isabella gave a non-committal shrug, but didn't pull away from his touch, a small acknowledgement of the difficult position he was in as well. Christopher knocked softly, then opened the door, ushering Isabella inside. Eliza had managed to raise the head of her bed slightly and had turned on the small bedside lamp, casting a warm glow over the room. When she saw Isabella, her breath caught audibly, and tears immediately filled her eyes. "Isabella," she whispered, the name emerging like a prayer. "You're so beautiful." Isabella stood frozen just inside the doorway, her eyes widening as she took in the woman before her. Despite the hospital gown, the bandages, and the evidence of the recent fire, the resemblance between mother and daughter was unmistakable. They had the same eyes, the same curve to their lips, the same slight tilt of the head when confronted with something unexpected. Slowly, as if in a trance, Isabella moved toward the bed, studying Eliza's face with intense scrutiny. Christopher held his breath, uncertain what would happen next. Without warning, Isabella reached out and gently took Eliza's uninjured hand, turning it over to reveal the inner wrist where the butterfly tattoo was partially visible beneath a bandage edge. She stared at it for a long moment, then raised her eyes to meet her mother's gaze directly. "Dad told me about the threats, about why you left," she said, her voice steadier than Christopher would have expected. "What I need to know is, would you have come back for us if the fire hadn't happened, or would you have just kept watching from a distance forever?" The directness of the question caught Eliza off guard, but she didn't look away from her daughter's challenging gaze. "I don't know," she admitted, honesty winning out over any temptation to offer a more comforting answer. "I wanted to. Every birthday, every Christmas, every time I caught a glimpse of you from afar, I wanted to reveal myself. But I was afraid of how you would react, afraid of disrupting the life you and your father had built, afraid that you would hate me for the choice I made." She paused, swallowing hard. "The fire changed everything. It made me realize how quickly life can end, how easily I could have died without ever having the chance to tell you the truth, without ever hearing your voice, knowing your thoughts, seeing the remarkable young woman you've become." Tears spilled freely down her cheeks now, but she made no move to wipe them away, her focus entirely on Isabella's response. Isabella stood perfectly still, absorbing her mother's words, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. Then, with a decisiveness that reminded Christopher powerfully of Eliza at her most determined, she leaned forward and gently embraced her mother, careful to avoid the bandaged areas. "I don't hate you," she whispered fiercely. "I don't understand everything yet, and I'm still angry and confused, but I don't hate you." Eliza's uninjured arm came up to hold her daughter close. a soft sob escaping her as 15 years of separation momentarily collapsed in the simple human connection of an embrace. Christopher watched, his own vision blurring with tears, as the two most important people in his life began the first tentative steps toward healing a breach that had shaped all their lives. He didn't know what the future held for them, whether forgiveness was truly possible, whether they could forge a new kind of family from the ashes of what had been lost. But for the first time in 15 years, he allowed himself to hope. As he watched his wife and daughter holding each other, Christopher realized that some part of him had always been waiting for this moment, some deeply buried instinct that had never fully accepted Eliza's death. Perhaps that was why he had never been able to move forward completely, why no other relationship had ever felt right. The butterfly tattoo had led him back to her, a symbol of transformation that had proven more prophetic than either of them could have imagined when they designed it all those years ago. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges they faced in rebuilding trust and creating a new definition of family, they would face it together. The fire that had nearly claimed Eliza's life had instead given all of them a second chance, an opportunity to resurrect not just a person, but the possibility of wholeness they had all been missing, even when they didn't recognize the emptiness by name.